You know what? I'm going to start off by dedicating this shiur. I'm dedicating this shiur to all those who fell in the defense of Gush Etzion and on the road to and from Gush Etzion and Toshavei Gush Etzion. And Gush Etzion means the wider Gush Etzion. From the beginning of the story that we're telling today in the 1930s until this month, and including this past month. So we're all part of this story. And before I start to tell, and I'm going to start from the end of, well, the end of the first part of the story, partly to get the saddest part behind us so that we can build up from there. And also because I think that's the part that most people know. And the first part is the part that more people don't know. So the version of the story, the end of the story, which you have in front of you, called Sowing with Tears, is a passage we printed in Skula Jewish History magazine a very long time ago, and it was written by Yochanan Yaakov, who is still the mythological archivist of Kfar Etzion. He was one of the people who built the archive after the return to Kfar Etzion at the end of the 1960s, after the Six-Day War. He was one of the children who were born in Kfar Etzion before 1948, and he's in his 90s now, and he just published a new book, so Mechayel El Chayel. I see that this week's subject has struck a chord. So I call this Sowing with Tears. And we are all part of the reaping with joy which goes on in Gush Etzion from year to year despite everything. It was on the afternoon of Thursday, May 13th, 1948, which was Daled Iyar, that the sound of gunfire sputtered to a stop in Kfar Etzion. The Jordanian soldiers of the Arab Legion burst through the gates of the kibbutz in their armored vehicles. The handful of exhausted defenders, their weapons few and their ammunition spent, stood facing waves of anger and hatred. As they laid down their weapons, they knew that their dream of returning to these ancient hills was over. The prisoners were duly photographed, then mown down by vicious gunfire. Only 2 of them managed to escape. The bodies of the rest lay abandoned among the ruins of the Jewish settlement for months before they could be reclaimed and brought to burial at the military cemetery in Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. The next day, Friday, May 14th, Hei Iyar, 1948, Yitzhak Rabin, commander of the Harel Brigade, stood on the roof of his headquarters at Ma'aleh HaChamisha and gazed in the direction of the Etzion block. Tears flowing silently down his cheeks, he watched through binoculars as the surviving defenders of the 3 remaining settlements, that's Ein Tzurim, Ravadim, and Ein Tzurim, Ravadim, and what am I missing? No, and Masuot Yitzchak, were taken prisoner by the Arab Legion. The marauders looted the settlements and set them ablaze. 4 red tongues of flame shot skywards, like Sabbath candles burning on the peaks of the Hebron hills. A voice crackled from the field radio. A Jewish state has been born. At that very moment, David Ben-Gurion was declaring the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, the state of Israel. So the story of Gush Etzion is integrally intertwined with the birth of the state of Israel. At the same moment when the broadcaster on the field radio broadcast Malka Nafla, which was the code name for Gush Etzion, Ben-Gurion announced the birth of the state in Dizengov's house in Tel Aviv. And it's crazy that the fall of Gush Etzion and the birth of the state are one and the same, and that every year the night of Yom HaAtzmaut in Kfar Etzion is in the shul, in the Bet Knesset in Kfar Etzion, is a crazy mixture of mourning and rejoicing. And that's also what Am Yisrael has created in this conjunction of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut. That's the end of the story of Kfar Etzion and the Etzion block. But the beginning of the story, and I think also most of you know that story, but the beginning of that story is as unusual, especially in the state of Israel, as it is wild. Because why is Gush Etzion called Gush Etzion? It's named after a man whose name was Holtzman. And Holtz means wood. Holtz means eighths. And for his 50th birthday, he purchased land here, in this area, and in honor of his 50th birthday, he called it Gush Etzion, Holtzman. Who was this Holtzman, and what is his story? So we're going to tell his story. And I don't know if we should talk about. No, we're going to tell we're going to tell Holtzman's story, and then we'll go back to the concept of Netzer Acharon. So Holtzman was born in the old city of Jerusalem in 1883 on Rosh Hashanah. His parents had come from the Pale of Settlement, and they were involved in the alcohol industry like many Jews, and they brought with them grape presses, on the understanding that Eretz Israel was a place which was suited for growing grapes, and that they could make a living. They didn't come to live off charity. They didn't come at the end of their lives to be buried here. They came to live and work and make a parnasa in Eretz Israel, which at the end of the 19th century was extremely unusual. They settled in the old city. They set to work. They raised a family. And Shmuel Holtzman, their son Shmuel, was not the oldest and not the youngest, but he was the one that they were most concerned about. He had a traditional Jewish education, cheder, yeshiva, and at the same time they could see that he was by no means satisfied by what he was getting. He was fascinated by biology and botany. He read all kinds of things in his own room, and they could see that he needed another side to his education. So in the hope that they would manage to find the right kind of education for their son as he neared the end of his teenage years, they sent him off to America, to Yeshiva University. As there was no yeshiva in Eretz Israel that could provide some kind of secular education in a setting that they trusted. What happens when you send a 17-year-old by himself to America to learn in Yeshiva University? Well, Shmuel Holtzman didn't do what they expected him to do. He ran around America, headed to the West Coast, was part of got the idea,
Gold fever.
Gold fever, craze for the gold rush. And in 1900, he set sail for Australia to join the gold rush there. And he ended up in Western Australia, and with the funds that he'd put together with his gold activities in America and in Australia, he purchased the site of a mine, a gold mine, which he called Mount Zion Mine in Bugadi in Western Australia. And he really made it. He brought a brother to come and help him. One of his brothers came to Australia to help him develop the mining business. And in 1903, he was in his 20s, he'd made it. He came back to Eretz Yisrael. He settled in Rehovot, and he wanted to make his dreams come true. What did he try and do in Rehovot? He was going to realize his parents' dream, essentially, of agriculturally developing Eretz Yisrael. He purchased land, he set up an orchard, and in 1905 he married one of the daughter of one of the wealthier residents of Rehovot, the Gordon family. Her name was Hindi or Ayelet, and they set sail on another adventure together just 2 years after they got married, sailing for the east to bring back all kinds of exotic species to develop to make Eretz Yisrael the Gan Eden, the paradise of the Middle East. What kind of species could be grown in this soil, with this climate? He went out to explore and bring back. He came back. That year with a ship which he'd kitted out with the most modern for the time. Right, this is 1908. Watering system, climate control system. It's all on the boat with all these rare plants. He arrives in Jaffa, and the Ottoman authorities won't let a single plant off the boat. And it sits there while the officials eat up bakshish, all kinds of bribes from Holtzman, while he sends repeated requests to have his cargo inspected and unloaded, but with the suspicion that the introduction of foreign species to the Middle East could make a tremendous difference, a negative difference to what could grow, like invasive species, which is like a new idea then. Everything stays on the boat. Gradually things wither and die, and eventually, when what does come off is offloaded, there's a third of the plants have survived, and Holtzman brings them to Rehovot. He plants them in his experimental farm in Rehovot, and he fights for every single plant to make it survive. And he creates a thriving experimental farm in Rehovot. This is the beginning of the fame of Rehovot before the Weizmann Institute for botanical experiments, and he gains a name for himself. He sends people examples of plant seedlings to try out, and the new horticulture begins to spread around Eretz Yisrael.
Are you saying he makes Rehovot into this place, or Rehovot was already that place?
No, Rehovot was not yet that place. Afterwards, the Weizmann Institute, well, it's not the Weizmann, but a branch of the Hebrew University will open there, but it's very possible that the reason that Rehovot already has a reputation for being the right place for botanical research is because of Holtzman. Absolutely clear, not absolutely clear, but it's a conjunction. In 1914, he's doing well enough that he decides to take his wife and their 4 children by now on a voyage of roots to Australia to see where their father made his fortune. And it's 1914. It's the summer of 1914. World War breaks out, and like so many people, they get stuck in Australia. So stuck in Australia that they can see that they have to settle down. They settle down in Perth, because Western Australia is where they were, where he'd been before, and there is not much of an Orthodox community in Perth, Australia, until the Holtzman family come along and give it a boost. And he becomes a pillar of this community, which is still a thriving Jewish community today. His family settle down, they put down roots, and the war drags on. And it's only in 1918 that the possibility of even going back arises. And by then, Hindi Holtzman has decided that maybe it's not such a bad thing to stay a little bit longer in Australia. The children are in school. Who knows what kind of education they're going to get if they come back to Eretz Yisrael? Who knows exactly what's going to happen in Eretz Yisrael now? It's not so clear which way the British mandate will go. They decide to give it a little bit longer, and it takes until 1927 for the Holtzmans to pick themselves up from Australia and come back to Eretz Yisrael. And this time they do. Holtzman again repeats his attempt from 1907. He brings back a collection of 200 new species for the Rehovot farm, which has in the meantime been neglected, overrun, looted. He comes back, and with the kind of determination which is going to become rooted in the soil of Gush Etzion, he rebuilds everything from scratch. One of the species that he's famous for is the pomelo. And he is the person responsible for introducing the pomelo to Eretz Yisrael, something called the tangelo to Eretz Yisrael. He specializes in citrus. He's in Rehovot, that's the right kind of area, but remember that he is a native of the Jerusalem area. He came from the Rova, he came from the old city. And so in 1929, in the 1920s, it starts in 1921, Arab riots against the British mandate, and the hot point, the flash point, is always Jerusalem and the old city, although terrible things happen in other places, but Jerusalem and the environs of Jerusalem are always almost the worst hit. And he decides that the only correct response to this kind of hatred and aggression and animosity is to create new places in Eretz Yisrael. There was a very small settlement near Jerusalem in this area called Migdal Eder, which was destroyed completely in 1929. Holtzman decides the right response is to come back to this place and establish a new ring of settlements in Gush Etzion. So he creates he does exactly the opposite of what the Sochnut, what the Jewish agency is doing at the time. He creates a limited company called El Hahar, and he invites investments. He invites people to invest in the land of Gush Etzion, and he has a whole program, a prospectus of what he's going to build here. He buys 5,000 dunam, and he calls them he calls the area the Etzion block in honor of his birthday, Gush Etzion. And he begins to plant, and he begins to advertise. And his advertising campaign is, there are some examples, if any of you, well, people who are on the list for this class, there's a PowerPoint with pictures from Gush Etzion. There's a book here which we'll pass around, which also has pictures. But he creates a whole advertising campaign of how this area is going to be a recreation and restorative area for people to come and get a break from the heat in the summers of Eretz Yisrael. And the concept is to create a village, which will be called Kfar Etzion, with a vacation inn, and a forest around it called Yar Etzion, which will be the idea is that this should be a spa area like they had in Czechoslovakia, where people come, they can go for walks in the forest. Gush Etzion is just hills and stones, and he has this vision.
Kind of like 1982. Efrat at least.
Okay. Right. Some of us have seen Efrat like that. And the first thing that he creates, and again, this is an incredible step, and this is the founding ethos of Gush Etzion. The first thing he builds is a clinic, which he builds at the junction of at the turn up to Alon Shvut, right, where the vineyards used to be, and now they're building the bus station. Right there, he builds a clinic, which is supposed to serve both the new Jewish inhabitants who have not yet arrived in the area and the Arab villages from the surrounding it. And his son, who has meanwhile finished studying medicine in England and has a nice little practice going, gets dragged back to Eretz Yisrael to become the doctor of the Etzion block.
I was actually going to ask him, did his kids leave with him from Australia?
They did. No, his kids came back from Australia. But again, in the 1920s and 30s, there are not so many options here, and he presumably has British citizenship from being in Australia, and making those investments. So his children have more options than most children here, and they also have the finances. And so his son goes to study medicine abroad. He brings him back. And this is the beginning of the clinic and the du-kiyum, the coexistence of Gush Etzion. What happens in 1936? A new bout of Arab rioting, the Arab revolt, and the clinic is destroyed, and the Etzion forest is uprooted. I think it's something like 2 million trees. Can't be 2 million trees. Maybe it is 2 million trees are literally pulled out of the ground and destroyed, which gives you an idea of how extensive the effort that has gone in is. And at the same time, the company El Hahal has been struggling, because not everybody buys into Holtzman's vision, and it's not so easy, especially with as the international climate becomes more difficult, and once 1939 arrives and the Second World War begins, there's no hope of bringing investors from abroad to Eretz Israel. And the company closes and Holtzman declares bankruptcy. But part of the reason for that is because his is a private initiative. And at the same time, most of the methods of settling new places in Eretz Israel is carried out by whom? By the Jewish Agency and the kibbutz movement. Like, where do the people come from? And there's suspicion that private enterprise is risky. And there's just been an attempt in the Galil to create independent villages by two Hasidic rebbes, which has completely gone bottom up, and the people and the land and all the expenses involved have just landed on the Jewish Agency. So they're not so keen on more risk. And the Holtzman is seen as a little bit suspect, and there are newspaper articles appear doubting his ability to follow through on everything he's promising in these prospectuses of Gush Etzion. And as we said, the company falls, Holtzman goes bankrupt, and the whole investment is wiped out. Just before war breaks out in 1938, Holtzman moves to England with his son and leaves everything behind him.
With the doctor?
With the doctor, yeah.
Does he lose the land? Like he bought the...
So what happens to the land?
Yeah.
The land is transferred to the Sochnot, and not transferred. It buys the land from the insolvent company Elahav. But you can imagine what it's bought for. And Holtzman seems to have, for a while, has had enough of adventures in Eretz Israel. He moves this time to British Guiana, and he begins mining again. He opens a mine called the Tikva mine. You can see that he's an incorrigible optimist. And in the meantime, after 1940 is when the JNF buy the land, and they're trying to work out what do we do with it. And all this, 1940 to 1943, is Aliyah Bet, is the time, is the period when people are struggling in any way to get out of Europe and get to Eretz Israel. And many of them are graduates of the youth movements, the Chalutzik youth movements, whether it's Hechalutz or Bnei Akiva or Shomer HaTzair, and they arrive here, and they've all been through hachsharot. They've all been through attempts to train them to live as farmers in a communal setting in Eretz Israel, and gradually, in dribs and drabs, individuals from these hachsharot make their way to Eretz Israel. B'derech lo derech, in this kind of stories that we told last week, and many of them join kibbutzim, and there are groups of young people who are all waiting and looking for a new place to go as a group and set up a new kibbutz. This is exactly the same time that there's a sense that every inch of Eretz Israel where Jews are not living, if the mandate ever transfers itself into a state, is not going to be part of that state. The idea of partition is already on the cards. And there is a sense that there is a struggle over every inch. So there is definitely a burning need to create new areas. Every new area that can be held onto has a chance of being included, and every area that isn't is clearly won't. So in 1943, a Garin, which comes from the religious Zionist pioneer movement, is called Kfar Abraham, decide to accept the offer of moving as a completely isolated settlement to the old site to the site of the original clinic and the beginning of Holtzman's works, and they settle in Kfar Etzion. Very soon after that, what?
What year was that?
1943.
That's why they're celebrating 80 years of Gush.
That's right. That's why this year is 80 years of Kfar Etzion, which is the reason that I said we would tell the story this week. Within a year, there are already 2 more settlements, Revadim and Masuot Yitzchak, and En Surim is added. I think En Surim is the last one, but I might be wrong with the order. Yeah.
We live in Neve Daniel,
Right.
and we always say Neve Daniel on the location of the Cohen family farm. When they talk about this history of Gush Etzion, no one ever talks about this Cohen family. Who were they and why did they live there by themselves?
I do not know. I do
Oh,
not
really?
know. I will try and
figured
find
this was
out.
like history somebody.
No, I did.
I've
No,
never
I
heard of
did.
it before.
If you look at the official name of Neve Daniel,
Yeah.
it's Neve Daniel settled on the Cohen family farm. The Cohen family owned that property before 1948. And like deeded it over to the Yishuv, but nowhere in the history books do they talk about this Cohen family and how they end up on this
very
mountaintop
interesting,
by
but
themselves.
it sounds like it's part of this story.
I feel like it has to be.
Yeah, it has to be part
Just
of this
somehow
story.
never seems to show up.
Because there were people who put down money to buy land from Holtzman, because the idea was that not that everybody that there was owned. It was supposed to be individual holdings, and then and people were supposed to come and live. It was supposed to be like Tel Aviv.
No, not quite. I thought it was
No,
more
not like Tel Aviv, but in the sense that it was private enterprise. The story that we're going to tell next week is going to be Tel Aviv. So the Garin is set, the kernel of the settlement of Gush Etzion in 1943 is created with a sense of some desperation, and everybody who joined this effort knows that they're doing something difficult, risky. Like it's a real Holtzman initiative, except that this time it's being done by the Sochnut and the Kibbutz movement. And very swiftly in 1947, as soon as the UN vote agrees to split Eretz Israel into 2 states, to partition between a Jewish state and an Arab state, everywhere where Jews live, which is not included within the borders of what's supposed to be the Jewish state, is immediately under attack. And is immediately, its safety is in doubt. And a big question mark hangs over all those places. And the 4 Yishuvim of the Etzion block fit exactly into that category. And from then on, the way to Gush Etzion is besieged, and it's very, very, very hard to bring supplies, and life becomes a routine of shmirot, of watch out, of guard duty, of defense, of waiting for the next delivery, however it's going to come. There were so many ways that they supplied Gush Etzion. There was a helicopter pad, there was a landing strip in Kfar Etzion, and they tried to supply by plane. They parachuted supplies here and there to the Yishuvim. And there were the famous convoys which set out from Yerushalayim, and one of these is the story of the Lamed Hay. One of these is the story of the Chanukah convoy that was ambushed. Which included Yochanan ben Yaakov's uncle Shlomo, who was killed when that convoy was attacked.
That's Nebi Daniel or that's Shayar Tassara?
That was one of the Shayarot to Gush Etzion. You know what? It could be that the place where it was attacked was
there was one known as
Nebi
Daniel.
Yeah, Nebi Daniel, and that's why it's called the Nebi Daniel convoy. And it literally, its life is its life under fire. When you think about it, and this is the last story, the last individual I want to put into our consciousness today. Many of those defenders of Gush Etzion had already been through, as we said, what was their route? They were refugees from Europe. As part of as many of the Hachsharot were also and the youth movements were the source of resistance in many of the ghettos in Europe. So many of them became partisans, and that was the defenders of many of these yishuvim were already veterans of fighting the Nazis in David and Goliath situations. And they'd survived that, or they'd survived the death camps. They were survivors of Auschwitz. Many of them were what's called Netzer Acharon. They were last survivors of their families, the only survivors of their families who emerged from the Shoah and made it to Eretz Yisrael. And many of them, very soon after their arrival, because again, those who managed to run the British blockade and get off the boats in the middle of the night on the shores of Yafo or Atlit or wherever it was, very often joined one of the kibbutz garinim and found themselves in isolated settlements. And many of them joined the Palmach. All of them were in the Haganah, and a disproportionate number of them, I would say, fell in Milchemet in the War of Independence in Milchemet HaAtzmaut. In Gush Etzion alone, there were about something between 120 and 150 of these of people who fit into this category, who were killed in Milchemet HaAtzmaut. 15 of them fell in Gush Etzion. So they were more or less a tenth of the casualties of Milchemet HaAtzmaut, and a tenth of that tenth fell in Gush Etzion. And there is a special, if you go from here, I'm hoping to go from here to Kfar Etzion for the HaZikaron at 11. There is a look out, you'll find there's a special andarta, there's a special monument which is called Andartat Netzer Acharon, the monument to the last branch, and there are 15 names on that andarta of the 15 people who were the only survivors from their family, who gave their lives in the battle for Gush Etzion.
Can I add one extra
Yeah.
sentence? Yesterday I was in Kfar Etzion, if anyone wants to see, there was a new memorial inaugurated in Kfar Etzion for the 22 women who fell fighting for Kfar Etzion. 7 of them were Netzer
HaZikaron, right.
It said 18 were Holocaust survivors.
No, 18
18
of the 22 were Holocaust survivors, 7 of them were Netzer.
Yeah, there was an event in Kfar Etzion last night.
It said in the thing that I read that it was the most number of women that fell in any battle in Israeli history.
Right, so that's part of the story of Kfar Etzion, because the big question, Kfar Etzion was of the 4 Yeshuvim, Kfar Etzion was the first, and it was I think the only one with families, where people were married and had children, and the big question in Kfar Etzion was, what do we do with children in this situation? It's crazy dangerous. They're living from literally from not from hand to mouth. They're living with their lives are at risk every single moment of the day. People are being killed right, left, and center. It's funny that Kfar Etzion was seen as a kfar, one of the villages of the area. So as every village had its muhtar, right? Kfar Etzion also had a muhtar. The muhtar, the administrative head of Kfar Etzion, was Shlomo Karniel. And before, in the months before the final attack, he was killed, and every time something a loss like that shook the settlement, the question came up: what do we do? Do we stay here? Do we carry on? Do we try to hold on to this place to be part of Medinat Yisrael, or do we give up and say it's safer to take everybody out? And in the end, there was a vote. And in Kfar Etzion, they voted to evacuate the mothers and children, and the women who didn't have children could choose, and most of them decided to stay. So that's one of the reasons that there were more women who fell in the context of Kfar Etzion than of the Gush than most other places.
There was also one, at least the video, if you haven't seen the movie in Kfar Etzion, you should know.
Yeah, so like
it follows this mother who chooses to stay and leaves her, and sends the baby.
And she sends their child. Right. So what I thought we would do is we would take just one example, and I wasn't planning on choosing a woman, but her name jumped out at me when I started looking at the Netzer HaZikaron page of Misrad HaBitachon. Her name was Atara or Crandall. Her Yiddish name was Crandall. Her Hebrew name was Atara Avramson. And she was born in 1926. So in 1948, she was 22. And she came from a shtetl called in near Lodz, which was attacked at the beginning of World War II, and so heavily bombed that everybody ran away, and then gradually came back and created a small ghetto in the area. And it's a typical story of forced work battalions and selections and transports to death camps. And she lost all of her family were murdered during the Shoah, and she was in work camps, and eventually ended up in Auschwitz. and then she she was liberated from Auschwitz at the end of the war, and she joined one of these many HaZikaron, which were trying to bring people to by Aliyah Bet, illegal immigration, on one of the ships to Eretz Israel. If you remember from last week, those of you who were here last week, during the war, about half, a significant number of the immigrants who came on the ships actually got here. After 1945, the British blockade was pretty much complete, and almost nobody got through. So she, like many others, came on an Aliyah Bet ship, which was followed by the British as it approached the shores of Eretz Israel, and when it docked in Haifa, all the young people on the boat started a hunger strike to try and prevent themselves being shipped away to somewhere else, but they ended up in Cyprus, and at the end of the war, she was one of those who came from Cyprus to Medinat Yisrael, and she had a choice. She had no family, no immediate family, and there was pressure from the relatives who had survived for her to live in a normal setting, and she decided that no, what she was going to do was join the kibbutz in Kfar Etzion. She wanted a religious setting. She wanted a pioneering setting. She wanted to make a difference. She joined Kfar Etzion. She became part of the Yishuv. She was, and she was there all the way through the period of the siege of Gush Etzion, and she was one of the people who made the decision when it was clear that there was going to be no relief, and it was basically a choice of fighting to the death with very little chance, or being evacuated and maybe getting out in one of the few convoys. She was one of those who decided to stay. And like everybody else in Kfar Etzion, they were just automatically became part of the Palmach. And she was here, so she was here for the last battle. She was one of those who was a choveshet. She was a medic, and she gave first aid when anybody was injured. And in when the attack on that last day on Daled Iyar on Gush Etzion began, she was one of those who were they divided into two groups. There was a group of defenders, and there was a group who we should talk for 1 second about the archive of Gush Etzion. There was a bunker where so there were there were the defenders who were firing until the end, and then told to lay down their arms and surrender. And the understanding was that the Arab Legion, who were leading the attack, was supposed to make sure that everybody was taken prisoner and treated as a prisoner of war. And of course that didn't happen. Instead they were taken and they thought that it was made to look as if they were going to be photographed, and instead fire was opened and they were all massacred. And the second group went into a bunker inside Kfar Etzion, but they took with them hand grenades and explosives. And they decided that if they heard that the kibbutz was attacked and fell, that they would explode the bunker. One of the things, and maybe this came from the legacy of the Oneg Shabbat archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. One of the things that the last defenders of Gush, of Kfar Etzion did was to keep very detailed records of their lives, and of course their letters were kept by their families who were living in Yerushalayim. But there was so letters between both sides were sent, were preserved, were kept, and there is from that time there is an archive with the recollections of people who were in Kfar Etzion until the end, and that archive was also hidden in a bunker, and so it survived. And that's the beginning of the archive of Gush Etzion, which is the beginning of the whole heritage of Gush Etzion, which has been created in Kfar Etzion after the kibbutz was recreated after 1967. It was pieced together, some from there, some from from families who had their relatives' letters, and gradually everything has been brought together, and the work of preserving the memory of the survival and the fall of Gush Etzion has become literally a mif'al chaim of the Gush. And just one second, about 5 years ago, they redid the audiovisual of the museum of Kfar Etzion, and it's now, I'd say, even more emotionally wrenching than it used to be.
It's really amazing.
But it's something which is not to be missed. Yeah.
Does Holtzman ever get to see his dream realized?
Okay. So what's the end of the Holtzman story? And we've got just enough time. So just to finish off the story of Atara. She was in the bunker, and they blew up the bunker, and she was killed when it blew up, and the next day the other 3 yishuvim, there was a negotiated surrender, and this time the inhabitants of the other kibbutzim were genuinely taken prisoner and taken away to first to Hebron and then to Jordan. The women for a few weeks, the men for over a year, and the big question was the bodies of those who'd been killed in Kfar Etzion. What would happen to them? And it took a year of negotiations until the army was allowed in by the Jordanians to collect what remained and bring the bodies back to Har Herzl, and they're buried in Har Herzl. Holtzman. So Holtzman, through all of this story, was far away, literally on the other side of the world. But in 1951, he came back to live in Eretz Israel, in the new state. And he settled in Rehovot. He'd had enough of adventures. His wife stayed in, when he went to New Guinea, his wife stayed in England. And he lived by himself in Rehovot. And he was always connected with the memory of Gush Etzion. And he always believed that at some point people would come back here. And in the same way as he spent his life rebuilding things which had been, attempted and shattered, and building them anew. One of the stories I didn't tell you was his ostrich farm. One of the things that he did in between was to import ostrich feathers from various different places. It ended up being Sudan, and bringing them to Rehovot and having them on the farm to harvest feathers for the hat industry. But he always, and that was another one that didn't work too well, especially once he was attacked by a couple of ostriches and just about survived. So he always believed that Gush Etzion would be rebuilt one day, and it only happened after he died. But his dream was realized, and Gush Etzion is here. Gush Etzion is one of those places which is firmly rooted in Eretz Israel, in the sense that it was bought with Jewish money by Jewish enterprise before 1948, and fell and was rebuilt. And the roots here are stronger in some ways than in many other places.
Also, historically, among Israelis, I still remember hearing Yitzhak Rabin a year or two before he was killed talk to a big, like Keren HaYesod group or something, that I was participating in a dinner, and they said, so it was post-Oslo, it was like between 93 and 95 when he was killed, and they said, are you going to give back everything? And he looked at them, he was a very blunt guy, and he looked at them and he said, yes. He said, in the end, I think we're going to give back everything except for Gush Etzion. I can't imagine ever giving back Gush Etzion.
Even Jimmy Carter said they wouldn't take Gush Etzion.
And I heard, I had a close friend, it's still today, who was a real, left-wing kind of guy, etc., shaliach and everything, atheist, etc. And he said, I'm not so happy that you're moving to Efrat, but at least it's in Gush Etzion, because there I could visit, that I could go to. So the historic memory in Israel, the kids who grew up here post the establishment of the state.
Right. Everybody grew up with the consciousness of that, in the same way as Har HaTzofim, became a symbol for longing. So Gush Etzion also was a place that you could see.
The Alon.
The Alon, the tree in at that junction next to where the clinic was. It's visible from Yerushalayim. And one of the things that the children of Kfar Etzion who grew up in Yerushalayim used to do was to go up on a roof every year and look in the direction of...
How did they see one lone tree? Was there literally nothing here to the point where they could just see a tree?
Nothing here. Everything.
I've always wondered how that story makes any sense.
Yeah.
If you're like, even
Also,
if you're standing in Efrat, you can't see the tree.
Very strong.
Yeah, because everything's built up now.
Right.
There was nothing.
You're saying it was just
Yeah, but it's still a
one
small tree over a long distance. It has to be incredibly strong binoculars
It
or
was a
something.
very,
Right.
yeah, people look
That's
from
such a long
people.
distance, actually.
What?
It's not such a long
To
distance.
Yeah,
see
it's
what's
not so
going
far
on.
away.
Yeah, it is.
Really?
In the same way that you can see, in the same way that you can see Herodion from Yerushalayim.
Herodion's much taller than a tree. We're talking about a tree.
But it's a big tree.
A tree standing in the middle of nowhere.
And again, it's not so much that it's a tall tree, it's that it was a very wide tree, and it's a green point, and everything was brown and burnt and.
And if you stand up high and that's a bit higher, it's the same as looking from the Veit
Yeah.
from the lookout point. You can see tons of things that are not necessarily
Right.
high when you're
Yeah.
up there.
See Ashdod.
So it wasn't so much that they wanted the land, it was more that they didn't want us in it.
They didn't want what?
That they didn't want us in it. If they wanted the land, they wouldn't have burnt everything and not settled.
Yeah, no,
Nothing
it's not
changed.
as
It
if
wasn't
they
about the
rebuilt
land.
anything. Like when we came back in 68, in the 70s, look at Masort Yitzchak. Nobody was living there. Nobody tried to live there.
Just destroying what we have.
But the people that took over, that captured Kfar Etzion, weren't really an army, right? They were more like a group
What
of local
happened?
guys.
What happened was after Yerushalayim was captured in 67, Rav Goren got into a command car with a few people, and he drove to Hebron, and with an Israeli flag on the command car, and everywhere he went, white flags came out, like flags of surrender. In Bethlehem, he drove through Bethlehem, and all this area. So theoretically, it was Rav Goren who conquered all of this area.
I actually didn't
Only
mean that.
because-
I meant the Arabs that conquered Kfar Etzion in 1948 is not an army per se. It's
It
more
was.
like
It
a
was.
group
There
of
was.
warring
There was. There was the Arab.
territories.
There was
The Arab
a
Legion.
unit of the Arab Legion, and everybody from the area who just wanted to be part of
My
it.
understanding was the reason they end up massacred is because it isn't
Yeah,
really a
because they-
formal army unit. Like
No,
in
what, so
the
it
old
Local got
was,
there
it was a
first
question
before
of
the-
willpower. You know, the Legion could have had the proper had more ammunition, could have decided to be in control. They decided not to be in control. This was the first victory for a place that they'd been attacking for years, and it had been a thorn in the side of the there was the Kalkji's army, and there was a determination to conquer it. So it was much harder to control the attack on Kfar Etzion than the next stage. That is not an excuse. But it didn't need to have been that kind of massacre.
So Holtzman's family, do they ever return to Israel? Like his children,
Yes,
grandchildren?
yes, some of his grandchildren, yeah.
Any
Where
of them
exactly they
here?
live, I don't know. I don't have that kind of resolution. But I think it's enough if you look at
It would be cool if
at
they-
what was there. What did Holtzman actually leave in place? The building of a clinic with the sign saying Gush Etzion on top of it, and that was basically it at the Tomet. And everything else which is here, was first of all there was the kibbutz buildings in Kfar Etzion, and then in Masort Yitzchak and Rivadim and Soin. But they were mostly destroyed. And you can see, and if you wander around Masort Yitzchak, you can see the remains of houses because they were never rebuilt.
The building that's down below the Rami Levi, what's the Habracha or something down?
Bet HaBracha?
Beit HaBracha. That's not related to
No, that's not related. It's not. No.
The building that's behind the Pina Chama, is that the original
Yeah,
clinic?
yeah.
That's the original one.
That's the
the clinic.
original clinic.
Oh.
Right? You all know it. You've all seen it. It's part of our daily lives, and we don't even
figure out what
And
we
now
don't
they've
even know what
redone
it
it,
is.
it's beautiful inside there.
Yeah, they've redone. They've yeah.
Where?
Wait, where is this building?
Right
Talking about
behind
where
the-
Mark-
That's
near the
where
gas
now the
station.
Tayarut Gush Etzion has now moved there. Like if you drive into the Pinachama and continue, it's on the right, just behind the Pinachama. No one notices. And also coming from Rami Levi, it's behind where they've blocked off the parking.
Wait, that's where the clinic used to be?
That's where the clinic used to be.
That's wild.
But that wasn't Kfar Etzion. That was Ein
No.
Sof or Reva.
That was Migdal Eder.
That was where Migdal Eder was originally.
What was
Okay.
the bracha? Was that it?
Bet HaBracha was originally some kind of monastery. It's not. There was also a monastery here, because originally some of the defenders of Kfar Etzion went to the Ratisbon monastery, and they were firing from there.
Isn't that where the Chatmar is now?
Where the Chatmar is, yes.
Isn't there still a monastery there?
No.
I've noticed the sign.
There are some some remnants, but nothing. Okay, I want to stop here because I want to get over to Kfar Etzion. Thank you very much for being with us. You didn't actually come, sorry. I'm lucky, no, I didn't do a call to action.
Tell people if anyone's interested in reading more about the story, the whole story is one of this.
No, they said it was chicken.
Oh my God.
No, the other. Yeah.